Story. So I read through your draft of your final, and it seems like you have an interesting story. You have obviously done your research. You know so much about these volunteer fire departments, so you have a very authoritative voice. When the readers read this, when I read it, I knew I could trust you and I knew what you were talking about. You made effective use of status details, sensory details like you always do. I was impressed at how you knew the exact dimensions of the various firehouses and the garages and the different colors of even the siren and things like that. So your details and your authority are there. Um, but you talked about when you posted this draft that you knew you needed to make cuts. And one way I think could make cuts is looking at all these descriptions of these different towns. So you open and end with the town of Newberry. So that leads me to believe that that's your intended focus. And I understand that you're trying to paint this overall picture of the Wabash Valley and these small town volunteer fire departments, but I think if you're going to focus on Newberry, you need to focus specifically on Newberry, expand your descriptions of that town, that fire station, the people who work there, and use more of maybe a summary narrative technique or just kind of shorten your exposition and descriptions on, the Riley Volunteer Fire Department or some of the other small towns. Because when you give an equal amount of description to each, I had trouble knowing what exactly the focus was. And, I assumed from your opening scene that you were trying to introduce the complication as, when you said Newberry is climbing its own Mount Everest. So I assumed that you were gonna tell the story of Newberry, but really it became a lot of different stories. And the context of those other volunteer fire departments is very important to your narrative. I don't doubt that, but I think that you just need to hone in more and you could make cuts when trying to describe these towns. Also, your descriptions sometimes lend themselves to more telling rather than showing. So, for example, and I wrote this in my written critique, you always list the exact population size of these towns, which is a very interesting statistic to read. But if you're going to do it for 3 or 4 towns, the numbers kind of start to blur together. And I know for me, they lost meaning the more and more population sizes you listed because I couldn't keep track of all of them in my head. And so I like what you did with the town of Riley, describing the color of the post office, the faded marquee. And so if you're going to consolidate your description of these other towns besides Newberry, you don't necessarily need to list all of their population sizes. You could use those techniques, like you did with Riley, to just imply and show readers, hey, this is a small town. It used to be kind of a Mayberry, but now it's run down. You don't necessarily need to come out with all those details because especially coupling those numbers with all the numbers you gave about fire department budgets, it just got really number heavy and it was hard to follow at times. So I think looking specifically at all the numbers you provide and finding ways to imply that it's a small town or imply that they have a smaller budget, show that rather than tell that. So one thing that I think could really strengthen this is more characterization. You kind of give brief characterizations of your dad and the other fire chiefs, but there's not one character that we're following on their own story arc. I know when you had originally pitched this idea, your intent was for the story to be about your dad, and it seems like it's evolved over time, which is fine, but I still think it would strengthen the story if you made your dad the main character. Start him. I like how you're starting with him in the car talking to you, but that kind of left me wanting more. I felt like I never got to know your dad more, and I think other readers would feel the same. So I think when you're, giving these descriptions of Newberry and the other town, put your dad in it. How does this compare with his own experiences in the volunteer fire department? And you do that some, but I just think it needs to be more clear that your dad is the focus because, there are times when you focus more on some of the other chiefs than on your dad. So it just gets a little confusing on who you want us to get to know. Also, I like that you write mostly in the first person and that you refer to him as dad and say dad and I. I think that's really effective and adds to your authority. But if you're going to do that, we need to know more about you. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just explain why we should trust you, why you care about these volunteer fire departments. Just something so that readers understand who you are. And also just be careful when you're using first person, because I felt like at times you switched between the first person and kind of the third person omniscient. And also at times, you referred to your dad as dad, but other times as Fox. So more consistency in that would help the story flow better. Um, let's see. Also, the other big thing that I really thought could benefit your overall narrative, it's very heavy on description and exposition and summary narrative, but we don't get a lot of those dramatic scenes. You write in scenes, and the scenes have complications. You describe the troubles that the fire departments are having, but we don't get a lot of action. I think it's a lot of you telling the story rather than letting these characters tell their own story. And so I think a good example of this was your story or your scene about the Medic 51 and the showdown between the competing fire departments and emergency personnel. That was a good dramatic scene. And when it came at near the end, it was a breath of fresh air because I was like, oh, here's some action. And so I think if you went back and looked through earlier parts of your story, you could find opportunities to add action. One example I gave in my written critique is when you're talking about the statewide legislation regarding tax cuts and caps. That, as it is, it's number heavy, and readers don't always like to read about taxes, and so I think that's an opportunity to present the tax issue in a way that doesn't make me feel like I'm just, talking to an accountant. You could create a complication. People are throwing things in the canal. There could be some sort of point of insight regarding the trouble that the volunteer fire departments have because of these new tax cuts and caps. Just there are opportunities throughout the story to really grow, more expand on the complications by presenting them as complications and not just telling us about them. So I think this story has a lot of potential. I like what you did with it. I enjoyed reading it. So thanks for your help this semester.